Mrs. Emily Thompson was a dedicated teacher at Greenfield High School, a small school located in a quiet, underfunded part of town. She had always dreamed of being a teacher. And for the most part, it was a dream she loved living. But teaching was no easy task, especially in a school where resources were limited and the challenges felt endless. The classrooms were old. The textbooks were worn out, pages dog-eared and barely hanging together. The school barely had enough money to cover the basics, and there was never enough to go around. Mrs. Emily did what she could to make up for it. She would spend her evenings creating lesson plans on a shoestring budget, finding free resources online, and asking for donations from anyone willing to help. She didn't mind. In fact, she often stayed late, working until the last bell rang. She would help students after class, staying for extra tutoring sessions. Mrs. Emily believed every student deserved a chance to succeed, no matter their background. Even when her own salary barely covered the bills, she never stopped giving. But it was hard, exhausting. There were days when she felt like no matter how hard she tried, nothing would ever change. The weight of it all was sometimes too much, but she always carried on. She loved her students, and they were the reason she didn't quit. Their smiles, their curiosity, and their eagerness to learn kept her going, even when things felt hopeless. In the back of her mind, though, she knew it would take something more than her dedication to really make a difference. Greenfield High needed help, and Mrs. Emily wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the fight alone. Little did she know, change was on the way. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon when Mrs. Emily decided to stop by her favorite coffee shop. She needed a quick break from grading papers and preparing lesson plans. The shop was small, cozy, with a warm atmosphere that always helped her clear her mind. She ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and let out a long sigh, wondering how she would manage to stretch her paycheck another week. As she was sipping her drink, a man walked in. He was dressed casually in a plain jacket and jeans, nothing flashy, but he carried himself with an air of confidence. Mrs. Emily didn't pay much attention at first, too caught up in her own thoughts. But then, as he ordered his coffee, he looked over at her and smiled. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, pointing to the empty chair across from her. Surprised, Mrs. Emily hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She was used to being alone, but there was something about his kind smile that made her feel comfortable. The man sat down and they exchanged pleasantries. His name was Mr. Stevens. They started talking about the usual small talk, how the weather had been lately, what they were both up to, but then the conversation shifted. "So what do you do?" Mr. Stevens asked, leaning in slightly, clearly interested. Mrs. Emily smiled, almost automatically. "I'm a teacher at Greenfield High School," she said. "It's not an easy job, but I love it. The kids are amazing." Mr. Stevens raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I can imagine. Must be tough with limited resources?" Mrs. Emily laughed softly, trying not to sound bitter. "You could say that. We do the best we can, but it's hard to give students everything they need when you're barely getting by." Mr. Stevens nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. Education is everything, but it's often the first thing that gets overlooked when it comes to funding." They continued talking about the struggles teachers face, the long hours, the outdated materials, the lack of support. Mr. Stevens listened intently, offering understanding and empathy. What Mrs. Emily didn't know was that Mr. Stevens was not just an ordinary man. He was a successful entrepreneur with a fortune that could change everything for her and her school. But for now, he was just a stranger at a coffee shop, listening to a teacher's story. A few days after their coffee shop conversation, Mrs. Emily was in her classroom, preparing for another day of lessons. She had just finished writing a few math problems on the board when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson. This is Mr. Stevens. We spoke the other day at the coffee shop. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I'd like to help. Let's meet again soon." Mrs. Emily blinked at the screen, unsure of how to respond. She'd thought about Mr. Stevens once or twice since they had met, but she never imagined he would follow up. Still, she wasn't sure what kind of help he could offer. Maybe he was just being polite. Curious, but cautious, she agreed to meet him again, and a few days later, they sat down at the same coffee shop. Mr. Stevens wasted no time. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, looking directly at Mrs. Emily. The situation at Greenfield High, the challenges you and your students are facing, it's not right, and I think I can help. Mrs. Emily wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but she was intrigued. Help? How? Mr. Stevens leaned back in his chair, his tone serious. I'm not just talking about a donation for a field trip or a few supplies. I'm talking about a real, long-term solution. Emily felt her heart race. What do you mean? Resources, funding, support, things that could make a real difference for you and your students, he explained. I've been lucky enough to have some success in my career, and I think it's time to give back. I want to help transform Greenfield High. Mrs. Emily's mind was spinning. But how? I mean, we don't have the budget for most of this stuff. You're talking about new computers, new books, a better environment for the kids. That takes money. A lot of money. I know, he said, nodding. That's why I'm offering to fund all of it. I can't fix everything, but I can help make sure your students have the tools they need to succeed. I'll cover the cost of new computers, textbooks, and even the things you can't ask for, like classroom upgrades and extracurricular activities. Whatever you need to create the best learning environment possible, I'll help make it happen. Mrs. Emily sat in stunned silence. This felt too good to be true. She had never imagined anyone, let alone a stranger, would offer so much help. You're serious? Mr. Stevens smiled. I am. I believe in the power of education, and I know you're doing your best with what you've got. It's time for you to have the resources to match your effort. Overwhelmed, Mrs. Emily tried to process what he was saying. But why me? Why my school? I can see you care, Mr. Stevens replied, his voice kind. I can see that you're making a difference, even with limited resources. That's why I want to support you. You're the kind of teacher who deserves the tools to succeed. Mrs. Emily didn't know how to respond. She had never been given this kind of opportunity before, and a part of her couldn't believe it was happening. But she also knew one thing for sure. This was the chance her students had been waiting for. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. I don't know how to thank you enough. You don't have to, Mr. Stevens replied. Just keep doing what you do best, teaching. I'll take care of the rest. And just like that, Greenfield High School's future was about to change forever. The transformation at Greenfield High School was nothing short of incredible. Within weeks, Mrs. Emily could see the changes taking shape. New computers arrived, replacing the old, broken ones that had barely functioned. The outdated textbooks were replaced with fresh, up-to-date editions. And suddenly, the students had access to resources they had only dreamed of. Mrs. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. The classroom, once filled with tired, worn-out materials, was now buzzing with energy. The students were more engaged than ever. Instead of struggling to keep up, they were thriving. The new resources allowed Mrs. Emily to teach more effectively, and she could see her students' excitement about learning growing with each lesson. One afternoon, she walked into her classroom to find her students discussing a new project, one they had never had the chance to take on before. They were using the new computers to research a topic in depth, collaborating with one another and sharing ideas. Mrs. Emily stood at the back of the room, watching in amazement. This was what she had always wanted, a classroom where students could explore, create, and think critically. The improvements didn't stop with the classroom. The school itself felt different. Teachers were no longer scrambling to make do with what little they had. The principal, Mr. Parker, was excited about the positive changes and began organizing more activities for the students. New field trips were scheduled, and the students looked forward to learning in ways they hadn't before. Mrs. Emily found herself filled with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She saw her students' faces light up with excitement, and it reminded her of why she chose to be a teacher in the first place. They were no longer just surviving in a school full of challenges, they were beginning to thrive. But through all of this, Mrs. Emily knew one thing for sure. None of it would have been possible without Mr. Stevens. His help had opened doors for the students, and they were walking through them with eager, open minds. The school had a new sense of purpose, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the future was bright. It was a crisp fall morning when the school announced a special event. Mr. Stevens had told Emily a few weeks earlier that he would be coming to visit the school to see how things were going. The students and staff were all buzzing with excitement, eager to meet the man who had made such a huge difference in their lives. Mrs. Emily had grown accustomed to his quiet, unassuming presence in the background. He had never made a big deal of his contributions, always keeping a low profile. Most people at the school knew him only as Mr. Stevens, the generous man who had helped them. But no one knew exactly who he was or why he was so eager to help a small, struggling school. The event was held in the school auditorium, where students gathered along with teachers and staff. Mrs. Emily stood near the stage, greeting everyone as they arrived. She was nervous, unsure of what to expect, but also excited to show Mr. Stevens how far the school had come thanks to his generosity. When Mr. Stevens finally entered, the room fell quiet. He wasn't wearing his usual casual clothes today. Instead, he wore a sharp, tailored suit that stood out in the sea of school uniforms and teacher attire. He walked with an air of quiet confidence, but there was something else about him, something that made Mrs. Emily's heart race. She wasn't sure why, but she could sense that this moment was going to be different. As he stepped to the front of the room, the principal, Mr. Parker, greeted him warmly. "We're so glad you could join us today, Mr. Stevens. It's an honor to have you here." Mr. Stevens smiled, shaking Mr. Parker's hand. He then turned to the audience. "Thank you all for having me. It's a privilege to see what we've been able to achieve together." Mrs. Emily felt a mix of excitement and confusion. She knew that Mr. Stevens had played a huge role in the school's success, but she didn't realize how big of a role he had actually played in the bigger picture. And then, it happened. Mr. Stevens paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. "I want to share something with all of you today," he said. "You see, I've been involved in a lot of businesses over the years, but what most of you don't know is that I'm also the founder and CEO of several successful companies. I've been fortunate enough to do well in my career, and it's because of that success that I'm able to help." The room was silent, the students and teachers trying to process what he was saying. "I'm a billionaire," Mr. Stevens continued, his voice calm but firm. "And I believe that we all have a responsibility to give back. When I met Mrs. Emily and heard about the challenges you were facing, I knew I had to help. It wasn't just about writing a check, it was about making a real difference." The words hung in the air, and it took a moment for the shock to settle in. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Mrs. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea. She had no idea the man who had been helping them was so incredibly wealthy. As the reality of the revelation sank in, Mr. Stevens gave a small, humble smile. "I've done my part to support this school, but what matters now is what you all do with the opportunity you've been given. You have everything you need to succeed. Now, it's up to you." The students were stunned, their eyes wide with disbelief. Many of the teachers exchanged glances, surprised at the quiet billionaire standing before them. Mrs. Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man who had given so much had been a stranger just a few weeks ago, and now, his true identity had turned their entire world upside down. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. The news of Mr. Stevens' true identity spread like wildfire through the school. At first, students and teachers alike were stunned, their minds racing to process the revelation. A billionaire, the man who had been quietly changing their lives, was in fact one of the wealthiest people in the country. It was hard to grasp, and many had trouble believing it at first. Some of the teachers, especially those who had worked at the school for years, felt a mix of amazement and a little embarrassment. They had all interacted with Mr. Stevens, but never suspected the depths of his wealth. They had assumed he was just another philanthropist, but they never imagined the extent of his generosity. For Mrs. Emily, the revelation was overwhelming. She had always appreciated Mr. Stevens' help, but now, knowing who he really was, it felt like a dream. She could hardly believe that such a powerful person had taken the time to invest in a small school like hers. She felt an even deeper sense of gratitude toward him. This wasn't just about financial support, it was about belief. Mr. Stevens had truly believed in her and her students when so many others hadn't. For the students, the impact was profound. They looked at Mr. Stevens with new eyes. At first, they had seen him as just a benefactor, someone who helped their school. But now they saw him as proof that anything was possible. A billionaire, someone who had achieved so much, was not only supporting them, but inspiring them. They felt like they, too, could make a difference one day. If Mr. Stevens could rise to such heights, why couldn't they? The teachers, too, were inspired. Many of them had given up hope on seeing real change in their classrooms, but Mr. Stevens' actions showed them that real change was possible when someone cared enough to act. In the days that followed, the school buzzed with excitement. Students talked about their dreams and future plans more than ever before. The atmosphere in the hallways felt lighter, filled with the belief that, no matter their background, they could achieve something great. As time passed, Mr. Stevens continued to support Greenfield High School, but his role evolved. He wasn't just a donor anymore. He became an active part of the school's community. He visited regularly, offering mentorship to both students and teachers. He held seminars where he shared his experiences in business and personal growth, inspiring students to dream big and work hard. Mrs. Emily, now more confident than ever, found herself leading a school that had completely transformed. The new resources had made her job easier, but it was Mr. Stevens's belief in her that had truly revitalized her passion for teaching. With her newfound confidence, she pushed herself and her students further, always striving for more. She helped students develop skills beyond academics, critical thinking, leadership, and resilience. She felt as though she had the tools to nurture their full potential. The school became a model of what a little support and a lot of heart could do. Other schools took notice of the changes at Greenfield and began reaching out to learn from their success. The media picked up on the story of the billionaire who had helped a small, struggling school become a beacon of hope. For Mrs. Emily, the impact of Mr. Stevens's generosity was undeniable. Her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Her students were thriving, her teaching was more effective, and she felt valued in a way she never had before. The weight of constant struggle had lifted, and in its place there was hope, a belief that things could and would get better. Greenfield High was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of possibility, and it was all thanks to one man's quiet decision to make a difference.